All right. Hello and welcome to the special edition of Red Spin Sports. Really happy to have Professor of History and Africana Studies from the University of Kentucky now, Professor Derrick E, on board for a little interview, kind of a book discussion, and also a little current event type stuff we might get to at the end, depending on how deep we get into the text, because I definitely got a lot of questions and things that interest me personally. And just, to put it out there again, it's Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Jake Gaither, Florida A&M, and the history of Black college football. Before we start off, just because just so much of this related to me being from Jacksonville, Florida, and then having gone from being at the University of South Carolina, where I was just telling you about, I studied under Cleveland Sellers, and it really opened my eyes to so much stuff about the world that you can't really know until you know. And then going to Florida State, and then really seeing that divide. A lot of people you think of segregation lines, and you still look at it today with the railroad there, and the way, FSU's up on the hill, and the valley, that little ravine, and then you got the hill where FAM is, and Bragg Stadium. And, was Damian Fleming, FAMU's quarterback, was a kid, I knew when I was there. And I remember Corey Fuller, who played at Florida State, was actually coaching there. Short-term Levon Kirkland from the Pittsburgh Steelers was there coaching. And I actually remember even being in the locker room when Bobby Bowden came to speak to the team after I was done playing, and he just sort of he just kind of gets around, So anyways, it's personal. And also Bob Hayes being just a legend in Jacksonville, Florida. And just a person. And one last anecdote: my dad, who was born in Jacksonville in 1953, so he, as a kid, even growing up in segregated schools at the time, because it wasn't until his senior year of high school where they were starting to integrate. He would always tell me as a kid that he used to always look at the college football scores in the morning, Sunday morning, look at that Sunday paper and look for the FAM score, because it would always be something like 73-0, what is it, 65-0, whatever. And that's really the context in which this sporting congregation idea come from. That's really the central thread in your book. And I just thought, before we kind of get into specifics, how would you define what the sporting congregation is? What was Jake Gaither's role? Maybe some other coaches too, like Eddie Robeson and others, in developing those. How is it maybe unique at HBCUs in terms of that sporting congregation? Some call fanhood, an imaginary community, but this is really not it's a very real community. Even if whatever people think about football, there's plenty of people that have views on that all over the spectrum. But how would you define the sporting congregation in the HBCU sense, and kind of those golden years, at least? We'll go back earlier, but is there any way to quantify I guess the level of play versus maybe an Alabama or other elite teams, any of that kind of stuff? But what did it mean within basically the African-American community at these given schools in terms of elevating the prestige of HBCUs and giving a sense of cohesion and identity for people?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me in to talk about the book. It's always an honor and pleasure to talk about your work. Let me say a couple things. One, the sporting congregation at Florida A&M and in Black colleges more broadly is really just a reflection, in my view, a reflection of the ways in which African-American communities organize in order to survive segregation in many ways, right? And so within the field of sports and sports history in particular, one of the dominant narrative is one of integration, right? So when we talk about race and sports in America, we're really telling a once integrated sports story going all the way back to Isaac Murphy and Major Taylor and all those folks in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And then we're telling a story of rapid segregation, the expulsion of Black jockeys, the discrimination Major Taylor faces in cycling, obviously baseball with Moses Fleetwood Walker getting pushed out of baseball. And then we talk about, then in that period, there's a whole conversation about, what Black organizations and Black sports happen at HBCUs, Negro leagues, et cetera. And then it's another integration story, Jackie Robinson, Jesse Owens, et cetera, into the mainstream. And so one of the things about that narrative is, in some ways, it I think marginalizes the ways in which Black folks experienced their own sets of sports teams, whether it's the Negro leagues or in this case, Black college football. And so Black college football is a really interesting kind of space to have this conversation an examination for at least a couple of reasons. One is that it puts the Black elite in the conversation about sports. I think that gets kind of overlooked when we think about the way we talk about sports historically. The second part is that I think that we think about Black colleges and the civil rights movement for more broadly, again, as this dominant kind of like we've been, we were facing segregation, but we really wanted integration. And I think that one of the things that gets lost is that Black folks wanted integration, but they also wanted integration on terms that were not going to eliminate the things that they were able to create. And so one of the things that I've always struggled with in my whole academic career is really thinking about not just simply the positives of integration, which there are tremendous numbers, but also the cost of integration. And so to understand the cost, you have to think about what was lost and what was gained. And a lot of this is when you talk to older folks, they tell you these, we used to have these Black business districts. We used to all these Black, and
it's sort of like the Killer Mike Black capitalism on steroids.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a lot of that's nostalgia. Like, it's not to say that it wasn't real, but it's rooted in nostalgia. And so how does one compare, for instance, the economic capabilities of a Black thoroughfare in a segregated community with the modern kind of capitalist market? Like, those are apples and oranges that we will never be able to rectify. But sports provides a lens, right? Sports provides a lens in part because things are played on fields. And so Black colleges become a space. And so in the course of the book, I talk about it and define it as this network of community, of scholars, of faculty members, of coaches, administrators, fans, the Black press as well. And so together they're working as a unit, right, to market Black college athletics. They're working together to sell the games, develop kind of community around Black college football classics and homecomings and things of that nature, as well as also basically reminding that these student athletes, many of whom were never going to play professional football, that they were going to go back into their own communities and be influential as, teachers or preachers or coaches or whatnot.
Right. Yeah. I wanted to just ask you about that real quick, because a big part of Coach Gaither's story, and it starts in, a lot of, I guess, in Appalachia, really, what you don't think of as being a heavily populated African-American area, but it's, doesn't mean there aren't. So, he comes to Knoxville College, right? And then he lived in Tennessee, Kentucky, kind of mountain area. But one thing he did at FAM, of course, he wasn't head coach until, I guess, 1945, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong. And that was sort of by accident, right? They kind of ran out of time and he had to coach the season. But he really put an emphasis on coaching clinics and the idea of bringing coaches together to discuss just sort of the pedagogy of coaching. And I always tell people too, in these debates about, sports and the value of sports that still rage on now. And especially when it gets to football, that I just don't have time to go on we'll get it too off track, because the levels of contradictions with the left, the political left, and, wanting to stand in solidarity with players, but then, the game, not seeing the game only through a lens of it, like within capitalism, not really seeing also that, people actually can love this game without just it being completely this wretchedly oppressive thing. Well, that game, that's real, but, don't take away the agency of people that are on the ground, talking about the Pop Warner Parks, the kind of community you see on a micro level that I think sometimes people don't see maybe in left spaces in academia. But nonetheless, how influential were those coaching clinics that Gaither had, not just in developing the Black high school football network within the state of Florida that we all know now is dominant in terms of national recruiting, along with Texas, California, Georgia, and some others. But in terms of just influencing that whole that whole practice in general of coming together, sharing knowledge, and making that mainstream, because it wasn't just segregated in that respect, right? There were instances of integration. I know he felt still did he hold on to that? What was the thing with Wallace Wade? First of all, you mentioned, I remember early in the book you wrote about that he felt miffed. He never got a response from him, the head coach at Alabama.
So one of the things that was pretty common in the mid 20th century in college football, but college sports in general, is that when coaches didn't make $9 million a year, they often served as faculty members on campus. And one of the ways that they made money in the summers was to do these coaching clinics. So they were paid, a little bit of money, a couple $100 and travel money to come to this camp. And they exchange information. This is where they, the coach, I would describe this as broadly the coaching fraternity.
Right.
And so the coaching fraternity, like all of America, was segregated. And so one of the things that Gaither experiences in some ways was, he's in North Carolina at the time, and he reaches out to Wallace Wade to attend a coaching clinic. And Wallace Wade, he's like, I want to attend the coaching clinic. I realize that Black folks can't do it, but I'm willing to serve as a janitor, to pretend I'm a janitor so I can observe the clinic. And Wallace Wade never really answered this email. There's no evidence that he returned and said no. He just didn't answer. And without answering meant that Gaither understood that he didn't have a positive affirmation to show up.
Right.
And so, in the summer, he begins working at Ohio State, working on his master's degree, and attends the coaching clinics up there. And so the coaching clinics in the North, most notably Northwestern, Ohio State, and Michigan, in the Big Ten, were pretty kind of progressive in the sense that they allowed a handful of African Americans to attend. And so one of the things that he does, along with Bill Bell, who was the coach who hired him down to Florida A&M, one of the things that they wanted to introduce when they got there is they wanted to improve the high school coaching in the state of Florida. Given what we know about the state of education in the 1930s across America, the high schools in Florida were not only just kind of lagging behind. This is the South generally, but when it came to football, most of the coaches, especially the Black coaches at the Black high schools, had little idea about what they should have been doing. Right. So they had teams, but they just didn't really have quality coaching. And so he saw this as an opportunity to recruit, right, to improve the players and the coaching in the state of Florida, but also recruit those players to his team. One of the things I think I noted, which was surprising, is that when they won their first national title, Bill Bell and Gaither, in 1938, I want to say, 3/4 of the roster was from the North, like Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And so because the football was much more developed, the high school football was more developed, and those student athletes who wanted to play knew that they had a better chance at playing at historically Black colleges in the South than they would going to Rutgers or Ohio State or whatever. And so one of the things that they do is they develop this coaching clinic, mainly targeting Black high school coaches. But when Gaither takes over the program in 1945, he is very instrumental about integrating the coaching part of the coaching clinic. And so he begins to invite white coaches from Florida State initially and the University of Florida. And then by the 1950s, there's a who's who of the leading coaches. Woody Hayes is down there quite regularly as Ohio State coach. Sid Gilman's down there. Bear Bryant's there. Adolph Rupp is there. John McClendon, who's probably the greatest Black basketball coach of that era, is there on a regular basis. And so it's just a well-organized coaching clinic. And so when I was in the archives and in the papers, you could see them talking about that a number of other Black colleges had coaching clinics, but none were as respected and well attended as Florida A&M's.
Right. Yeah. And I noticed too that the resentment you get, to season like high school football, it's always like, oh, you're recruiting and whatnot. Where do you draw the line between recruiting versus like maybe a kid just doesn't want to go to your school, sort of thing. But nonetheless, Bethune, BCU and at EWC at the time, Edward Waters. And I mean, it got to the point where they basically we're just like, man, it's not even, I mean, the whole fence around Florida thing that you hear people talk about in recruiting, I guess really goes back to Gaither in that sense, because, he had a level of just dominance over that no one else had. I kind of want to start going and work backwards. So I want to get to I think one of the central points I want people to be aware of is what really I was fascinated by is the idea of integration, but integration on terms and the way integration was done being something that was actually in a lot of ways harmful to Black communities. I mean, it's not talked about because I think some people are afraid to, because someone sees an excerpt or something out of context and you're talking about it not being good, but no, this in the sense that, all the Black schools and high schools, you look at where Bob Hayes went to high school, Matthew Gilbert was shut down. you had to go somewhere else. Like they just recently, a few years ago, got even Letterman jackets from the city of Jacksonville for their 1958 state championship. And for those of you who don't know, Bob Hayes was Dallas Cowboy Super Bowl winning wide receiver, like, was Staubach caught, just was instead bullet, called him Bullet Bob Hayes, the U.S. Olympic runner too. But Gaither had this idea of wanting to like try to integrate in like, it was sort of a vision of like what we all talk about now. What would some of these FAM teams have been against maybe some of like Bear Bryant's great Alabama teams that included guys like FSU, former FSU D coordinator Mickey Andrews and Bart Starr and whatnot. I mean, what would have been? We might have gotten an answer to that, but it seemed that there was an effort amongst the PWIs to not only not play them, but to intentionally like make sure that they like neutered their ability or like just completely like made sure they were relegated to like just D1 FCS status before they ever agreed to play on an equal footing. So what was Gaither's vision for what he hoped like would come out of like civil rights and like for a vision for like an equitable integration? And I don't know, maybe now there's still a template there because you're starting to see the discussions about what could look like for if people start going back to HBCUs. You see Deion Sanders and his son at Jackson State, and Macher, the hooper out in Cali, going to Howard. But what was Gaither's vision, and kind of like, and how did it go wrong, basically?
A couple things. One is that, college sports had an advantage, especially college football had an advantage in the sense that they could observe what happened to the Negro Leagues, right? That when Jackie Robinson desegregated Major League Baseball in 1947, the Negro Leagues rapidly disappeared, right, and rapidly declined. And so within a decade, the Negro Leagues had closed up all its teams for the most part. And one of the things that Black colleges were able to see in that process is that they didn't want that to happen, right? And so they felt that that integration, that they had to support integration in the broadest concept, right? But they also did not want it to be individualized integration about players and not about teams and programs and institutions. And so they, one of the way Gaither tries to thread this needle is he's always trying to give and provide his opportunity. It's not just Gaither. This is what I would argue the broader sporting congregation is trying to do as well, because they are watching these college football teams and they're thinking that, Florida A&M or Prairie View or Southern, Tennessee State, Grambling, et cetera, are as good or better as any of these top white programs in the country. They just have to get the opportunity to play. Right. Now, this is and so this is the way they are imagining. And so they Florida A&M in particular is stored it in a couple of ways. One, that the state of Florida, the governor actively disallows Florida A&M from playing in at the time the NAIA playoffs, which was really the only segregated space that Black college football could play in and basketball could play in. And so they didn't want that to happen, especially when the championship or the tournament playoffs were held in Florida at the time in St. Petersburg. And so they kind of nixed one of Gaither's great teams in 60 or 61. And so, but this is the broader kind of sporting, like the Black press is constantly trying to get an opportunity for their best HBCU teams to measure up. Yeah. Because they're pretty clear. And one of the things that the coaching clinic does for Gaither, but also a whole host of Black colleges, is they're fully aware that these Southern coaches at PWIs are more than excited, would love to have their best Black players. They just know that the circumstances won't allow them to put them on their roster, right? So this is where it gets this kind of complicated racism where, you take someone like Howard at Clemson, right? Frank, who was like, notoriously racist, right? Like Derrick.
Can I quote from your book real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
That's really, really short. But he said Clemson head coach Frank Howard on page 121 here in Championships and Civil Rights sent a letter to Gaither after a season in 1959 where, the Rattlers were striking all their opponents and knocking, and winning big all the time. Whereas, the University of Florida, Florida State, and Miami, people call the Big Three now, we're all down. And you just, you almost like wonder if like this guy's like this sadistic or evil, if he just like thought like, oh man, well, you're doing well. He says to Coach Gaither, congratulations on being the only coach in Florida to escape the noose this week. Right.
Yeah, so, I mean, it was because, and this is not because he was trying to be sadistic, right?
No, like, he thought he was being nice.
Well, they had, right. In the early part of that chapter, I talk about how the students at all the campuses at Miami, Florida, and Florida State had hung, as well as Tampa, I think, even hung their coaches in effigy, right, in the noose, right? And so Frank Howard had this really interesting relationship because he had come to the coaching clinic a number of times. And there's a letter, I don't know if it made it in the book, but there's a letter he writes to Gaither about, thanking him for fixing his run game, right? Like that Clemson's running game was not working. Right. And Gaither at the coaching clinic had taught him a new way of thinking about the blocking angles and allow for the running game to improve. Right. And so Frank Howard wrote him a letter. But when Darrell Hill, who's the first African-American player at the University of Maryland, makes the trek to Clemson, Frank Howard is on the field calling them all kinds of N-words and like trying to intentionally rile the fans up. So you get this thing that's happening behind the scenes, but in the front, right? And so these coaches are both complicit in contributing to the kind of racism at their institution, but the coaching fraternity in and of itself was I think far more pliable in terms of race. Yeah. And that comes later, right? So the letters that he's sending to Gaither is in the 50s. Right. When desegregation comes to Clemson, like is a real question at Clemson, it's in the mid 60s. So like,
and Professor White, if I could, like, was this a fair analogy? Because like, I always heard this, and like even my own granddad, bless him, he's 99 years old now. I went to West Point, one of the last few World War II vets left. And I get into these discussions, not so much anymore, it's kind of gone, but like where, about race, and like, I'd be like, who are your black friends? And of course, they'll just be like naming like people he has like relationships with, I think that's a common thing that I don't even call it blind spots. That's just characterizes the quote greatest generation that, that's I kind of have issues with, but nonetheless, the idea that there's like amongst white supremacy in the South, and it's something I've witnessed as a kid and having and hearing, just being around other people. Thankfully, my parents didn't push any of that, but just culturally being around that, the idea of like loving the individual but fearing the collective. And to me, Frank Howard, it's like he could love Jay Gaither. He's a friend of mine, whatever. But when it comes to the idea of like black people integrating this sport, then like he'll see that as a threat. Is that a fair way? That's a fair
assessment too. And I think he could also appreciate and like Jay Gaither in private, right? Like that's not unusual, right? Whereas as desegregation was extremely public, right, in terms of the ways in which he had to, in some ways, perform for the supporters of Clemson's athletic department and their football program, right? And so I think that's also part of that role as well. So I think you're right on, spot on in that point.
All right, good. So to go back a little bit though to earlier in the book, I wanted to hit on some of the earlier figures. I could go into the earlier life and how with Gaither and how he was his dad wanted to be a pastor basically, right? He didn't want but the irony sort of in your book is that he became a pastor of a far bigger congregation and had an influence that his father never could have imagined, probably. And I think his dad, you said, only saw him play once. But nonetheless, he kind of he's went on his journey. One thing led to another, bounced around. One thing that I found really fascinating and harrowing was like while he built up like this program through the 1930s, finally reaching, getting to where he arrived back at FAMU, seeing the beginning of like the sporting congregation, the issues with they were just chronicled very in detail in your book about the lack of integration, and then the issues of and within the military, and then this sort of contradiction of like, well, because it leads me to like sort of wanting to inject Paul Robeson into the discussion. He's someone that I've always noticed has been written out of history in a lot of places, but being here in New Jersey it's sort of like because of the local tie, you see around Rutgers, there's streets named after him. There's a football classic. Robeson would have been in stark contrast to the coach Bell, right? Because Bell is sort of a symbol of like, I guess, assimilation, that we got to like, I got to make these sacrifices. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Man, I'm looking at it. It's sort of like, maybe not assimilation, but like we got to like be patriotic. And if we're not respectability politics, perhaps, I don't know. But
I mean, Robeson is a complicated case, right? Because his older brother is Benjamin Robeson, goes to World War I and is in the Harlem Hellfighters, right?
But to be clear, I was talking about Bell in contrast.
Right? Yeah, no, yeah. So yeah, no, Paul Robeson's the way he thinks about it is starkly influenced in some ways by the experiences of his brother when he comes back from World War I. Benjamin Robeson, who's a member of the Harlem Hellfighters. And then he sees the kind of, lack of respect that Black military vets face. But for a large percentage of African Americans, military service and proving one's support of the United States was part and parcel. And so Bill Bell, who was the head coach from 1936 to 1943, he leaves the program after the 42 season, and in early 43 he enlists into the military because he saw this as part of his service. And I think that Gaither felt the same way, right? I don't think Gaither thought differently. He just had his ability to enlist was compromised by his age. He was a little older. He was already in his 40s at that point. And then two, he has the two brain tumors right in the 1940s as well. And so once he has brain surgery, that makes him completely unfit for service. But, Gaither believes that. I mean, that's one of the reasons that he loved Bob Hayes so much, that he was very much, Bob Hayes had exemplified what Black colleges and Black sports could do, right? Is provide this opportunity to show what we could do as humans and as equals on this national and international stage. And so Gaither later on, even in the 68 Olympics, when John Carlos and Tommy Smith protest, he's actually very critical of their protest because he felt that they had not abided by these things. So, Gaither's a complicated figure. I actually like Gaither a lot, in part because he's not easy to pigeonhole as like, he's not Paul Robeson. So you can't like put him, you're like, he's this radical, but he's an institution builder. And I think that keeping and supporting and promoting Black institutions, are going to lend itself to these kinds of complicated decision makings, thinking about the ways in which power that is operates, and the way that FAMU needs to keep its doors open. It's going to always have to make certain kinds of compromises.
Yeah. Would you see then, like, I remember studying with Dr. Sellers would talk about Booker T. Washington's perception of conception of like a talented 10th to get have 10% of the Black population excelling and kind of being like a leadership class. And I guess hopefully over time, maybe bring people up that way. But obviously Du Bois had a stark criticism of that. But I feel like that Gaither's maybe not all the way Booker T. Washington though. I mean, he's maybe somewhere in between there.
I think there's two things happening here. One is, I think Booker T. We've undersold the impact and importance of Booker T. Washington, because Du Bois's criticism is so sharp, and most of us agree with that criticism. I think that speaks to the fact that Du Bois's kind of academic credentials are so influential in the way that we remember the past and understand it. And so some of that. But the thing I always tell students about this situation is that we got to remember that Booker T. Washington was, he was extremely popular in many Black homes, especially in the Deep South, right? Like he was the kind of person that could get things done, right? The business league could get things done. They could borrow money. They could get you a store built, the entrepreneurship. You can have your house built. Those are real kind of things. If you're a Black college that you had to appeal to, Booker T. Washington had the ability, the purse strings. And so how he at times used and abused that power, I think was what the source of Du Bois's criticism.
Right.
But I'm always pointing it out that when Booker T. Washington gave his Atlanta Compromise speech, there's a letter of thanks from Du Bois talking about how spectacular the speech was. And so I think that is, and I think that Black colleges, especially public Black colleges in the Deep South, are often wrapped into these kind of contradictory spaces, right? Because I think that the division that we've created between, Black higher education between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington is probably too stark than the reality. James Anderson's great classic book, The Education of Blacks in the South, talks about how that, most schools couldn't afford to be either Booker T. Washington or Du Bois, right? That they had to really blend these two sets of ideologies in order to encourage and enroll students, but also to encourage and enroll and to garner kind of financial support.
Right. No, that's fascinating because I think that we live in a very polarized society now, right? And people want to say, this is the right line on things, this is the wrong line. But when you look at the context, it's sort of like, my co-host, Michael Sampson, who's done a lot in the movement over the years from organizing a lot of the stuff with Dream Defenders early on after Trayvon Martin was murdered, all the way through to labor struggles and a lot of community work now and back in Jacksonville. And he really gets frustrated with some people on the left about how, immediately you have the Milwaukee Bucks do something like last summer that was just unprecedented, just in the locker room. It's what Craig Hodges dreamed about, but he couldn't organize with the Chicago Bulls teams. But them just saying, no, we're not playing, we're shutting this down. And sure, people can say Barack Obama's influence and Jordan coming in, they should have kept going. But a lot of these people, if you want to criticize like that, I'm in a teachers union, and we went on strike 2018, so almost 3 years ago now. And there's so much that goes into that. And I just want to make sure that when people are throwing these criticisms out there, they understand that, okay, you're going to throw that out there, then you go and make sure you're willing to go on strike on your job too, right? And if you're not willing to, then maybe you should think twice about throwing, all this shade, especially athletes that have been ensconced from a younger and younger age. Well, in this culture of AAU basketball or going to camps, really not. I don't think a lot of people outside of that world fully understand how when you get identified as being a talent who someone's had a chance to make it out, it's not. There's some people that are not all unsavory characters. There's guys that legitimately want to see people do well and help them. And, with the way the NCAA is, it's any of that help is, of course, deemed exploitative and unacceptable, even though the irony of what the NCAA does is lost on them entirely. But this whole notion, tying it back to, the Booker T. Washington and the Du Bois thing is the idea of, being dogmatic one way or the other. I remember Dr. C.L.R. saying, that, it doesn't have to be one or the other necessarily. When you look at society, different people serve different roles. You just mentioned how, Robeson and how he came to the consciousness he had, how he developed the radical, politics he did. It was out of a certain set of material conditions and circumstances. And sometimes I just feel that, I'm sorry, I'm ranting here for a second, but it's just the notion of having to put we discount organization and having organizational structure sometimes, and the importance and what it means to actually be able to get things done, because there always have been in society. There's the artists, there's the theorists, there's the people that push change, but there also has to be people that make sure the water's running, that people are that the services are being provided, that things are getting done. And Gaither, I think, threaded that needle, and when you look at the trajectory of his life in the different periods it spanned. I just think it's fascinating. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there just in response to what you were saying, because I think that you make really good points about, the way in which you feel you almost got to be on team Du Bois, or if you're even saying anything good about Booker T. Washington, so you're immediately branded as some suspect, who, right. Well, so I'm sorry, I didn't mean to digress that much, but I just, that reminded me of something from Dr. Sellers we talked about. And but also what you did mention was the brain stuff with him. And I thought one of the anecdotes in the book I really want to hear just sort of some background on, and maybe let you explain it, was just about Barney Brooks, Cobb Pilcher, who Cobb Pilcher was, how his wife, Jake Gaither's wife, Sadie, got in touch with Earl Odom, one of his former college teammates, and helped arrange this, and how this whole life that we know now of Jake Gaither, and I just can speak from being in Tallahassee. The local golf course there is Jake Gaither Golf Course. There's so many people that just say Jake Gaither's name every day in Tallahassee that don't even probably know who the man is. But obviously people that like understand FAM and the history will, but like, it's everywhere. So what were some of the issues with Gaither's health, and like what role did this Cobb Pilcher guy play in kind of like helping Gaither stay alive, but also kind of having a very kind of forward-looking approach to the race that was sort of not what you see typically in the South at the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, Gaither, is coaching basketball in, I think, 42, and is struck down really with these terrible migraines, in which he loses weight, is in a really bad shape. His wife recognizes, he goes to the doctor, and they're like, we don't know. They describe it as Meniere's disease, and then they call it vertigo. Mm-hmm. And then, she calls a classmate of his who was a professor at Meharry up in Nashville, and he comes down. He listens to him over the phone, and he comes down to Tallahassee, and looks at his former classmate and is like, diagnoses him as like, look, he probably has a brain tumor, and the only place that you can get this fixed in the South is Vanderbilt. And so they arranged for him to travel to Nashville. And because Odom had developed a relationship with Cobb Pilcher between Meharry Medical School, which is a historically black medical school, right, and Vanderbilt, that Cobb Pilcher agreed to do this surgery for like little or no cost. And it's a really kind of empowering story. We think about the ways in which, race and racism are both porous and also rigid. And this is one of the ways in which it's porous, right? Right. That Cobb Pilcher had this experience when he was at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, I believe, working with the guy who did the Blue Babies. If anybody saw the movie, Something That the Lord Has Made with Mos Def, this is an old HBO movie, but Cobb Pilcher was in that lab, and so he had this experience with this surgical tech who created all the techniques that eliminated blue babies, which was like not getting enough oxygen. Mm-hmm. So anyways, long story short, that Gaither goes to Nashville. Cobb Pilcher performs this, I think, really kind of at the time cutting edge surgery. They have to lift a piece of his brain off. They drain the spinal fluid, and then they take an X-ray, which at the time was a fairly new technique. They discover there are 2 brain tumors instead of 1. They surgically remove the brain tumors, and then Gaither's in, and then they don't know. They hope that he survives, right. And he does rehab in Nashville, and then he lives with his brother in Columbus, who's at Ohio State or in Central Ohio, and eventually they make their way back to Tallahassee in late 1944. Early 1945, and he's just on campus, trying to get himself back together. Right. When the war is over in 1945, that summer, the previous coach, there was an interim coach between a head coach that after Bill Bell left, and he's like, I'm taking a job at another school, and then Bill Bell's like, I'm not coming back.
Yo, can you get into that? That allergy stuff was wild, man.
It was interesting. It's interesting because if you've been to Tallahassee, so and so the story that was in the archives, right, that was in the paper, was that Bill Bell's wife had suffered from such severe allergies in Tallahassee that she basically had stopped living there even before he had went to the military. Mm-hmm. And I think he realized that going to the military, that once he returned, he wasn't going back to Tallahassee. Mm-hmm. And so he takes a position at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, and that's where he becomes both a coach and administrator over there for decades. And Florida A&M has to hire a coach, and they have to hire a coach in this, which is really the most obscene, chaotic moment in college football history, which is all the men who survived World War II and who had played college football either in the war, learned in the war, or before the war are now immediately eligible to return to any school they want to. Yeah. So they can return to this. If they were in college, they can return to the college that they were at. Right. If they weren't in college, they can go to a new college. If they don't like the college they were at, they can transfer. So I liken it to, this is like almost like a kind of a free for all this year. And Florida A&M is entering this season with no coach. Right. And so basically between the GI Bill, which is paying for all this college, there's no scholarships in this day. Right. The GI Bill is going to pay. All these men have free college. So they're getting recruited. And so one of the things that you see, you're from Florida, like one of the things you see all the time is this massive change in higher education. So, you know, Florida, the Ohio State, which is one of my alma maters.
Right. Yeah. So you got your Ph.D., right?
Yeah. So Ohio State will go from, you know, it'll squeeze down to in the, 8,000 during the war, and it'll jump back up over 20 because it was at one point over 12, and then the decline of men for the war, you see this rapid decline, and then they'll jump up to like 20,000. So all these colleges, especially the big public state colleges, are busting at the seams and growing. This is how we get these big, massive institutions that we think of today. Well, historically, Black colleges are not really any different. They're just happening on a smaller scale. So people are coming to Florida A&M because the Florida A&M is a bigger school than Bethune-Cookman and Edward Waters, who are both private. And so Florida A&M is able to really get some of these young men who are attending their school back into their football program. They just don't have a coach. And then Gaither, without telling Sadie, decides to his ass and accepts this job. And really key for him is the assistant coaches, because they're going to do a lot of the work, because he's still not at 100% from the brain surgery from over a couple years earlier. Right. And from there, the rest is like literally history, right? Like the first year they go 8-2, and he doesn't win. He only loses, 3 or more games twice in 25 years. Yeah. It's that kind of domination. Like, and
if
so
I could just, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, all right. So, I just wanted to read this from the beginning of chapter 4, the first paragraph, where you write that the golden age of Black college football begins. And I think this really spoke to me, just having the experiences. But the pollen from southern live oak trees fills the Tallahassee air every spring and summer. Pods resembling green worms hang amid Spanish moss from the iconic trees' unfurling branches. As the temperature warms, the pods erupt, and breezes carry the pollen throughout the city. Unbearable as this seasonal ritual was for allergy sufferers, few in the FAMU community could have guessed that the annual nuisance of sneezing and watery eyes would shape its football future. I mean, holy crap. You literally have, Bell go to North Carolina A&T based on saying his 6-year-old son's asthma attacks for the reason. And then right after that, this Herman Buck Nielsen is saying that his wife can't bear the pollen either. So it's like, you think you're between the brain tumor, and then you think between those two things happening, that people that say life's just random, it's kind of hard to argue with that there being some kind of plan, or maybe it's how there's some sort of plan there we don't know about. But that's really, really wild, and it makes you think that man, I don't know, man. People believe in destiny. Maybe that's where Gaither was supposed to be. But a couple things I just thought real about the brain injury. I mean, just one quote was just one of the choices where he could remove Coach Gaither's skull and identity. I didn't know is that even a practice still, that you could actually remove the skull from the brain and then put the thing back on there? That was
so my wife is a physician. So when I was writing this is where I had I had inside help.
Okay, I got you. All right.
But that was, as far as I could tell, that was the that was the primary method until they figured out how to withdraw briefly the spinal fluid from the brain, around the brain, so that they could take an X-ray. And so that in and of itself is very dangerous. Yeah. Both of them are very dangerous in terms of how they do it, but the spinal, removing the spinal fluid for any amount of time just so they could take it is very, it creates all kinds of side effects. But the other one is far more invasive, right? And so you run the risk of infection. And so they took the less invasive procedure, but it was newer and less proven, which is kind of what we do now. This is the way we investigate brain fluid now. As my wife says, that the X-rays, because of the brain fluid, would just come out one color no matter what. So you wouldn't be able to differentiate.
I just try to imagine sitting there being the doctor's all right, so, we can just remove your skull, and just being what's the other option?
Yeah.
And that one might be even more dangerous. But anyways, yeah, I mean, one thing that was wild to me was like how you really see the goodness of Pilcher's heart. I mean, taking a $100 payment, but I think the quote that he said, like, I think is really in need of of being pulled out, because it gets to this idea of what healthcare and the centrality of it, and like why Dr. King would say that the greatest form of injustice is in healthcare. I mean, what else matters, right? If you don't have healthcare, and the idea that, we'd say everyone has a right to K-12 education, but really because of like anti-communism, Red Scare type tactics post World War II, we, unlike the UK, Canada, in this country, never developed a public health system. And I think it's just, when you look at the idea, what the quote was here, that he goes, this is what Pilcher said: when I'm there's a neurosurgeon, when I'm operating on a rich man, I charge him a rich man's fee. When I'm operating on a poor man, I charge him a poor man's fee. And I try to give them both the same service. And that's just powerful to me in terms of just like, because that right there, you see the ideology of just like it to him, it's common sense. It's like, that this idea that we just have this just ultra bureaucratic system. And it's funny, people always talk about socialized medicine and stuff, not realizing the insane rationing we have in this system. I mean, I unfortunately dealt with some serious injuries from football, so I know this stuff way too, inside and out, way too much. But the amount of rationing that goes on, the amount of like people whose jobs just exist to try to find ways to find like technicalities that get people off, boot people off coverage and whatnot. Imagine if all those resources were just poured into like, actually trying to make people well. And the number of Jake Gaithers that didn't have access to like a connection like that we've lost. So, I mean, I just think it's important to frame it like that.